on Photography is a series of conversations with contemporary image makers, critics, gallery directors, and theoreticians. I'd like to welcome you all to a session of VASA's On Photography, conversations with filmmakers and photographers and other image makers. Today we're very lucky to have with us Giorgi Mrevlishvili. I know, I'm sorry, I mispronounced that last name. But Giorgi he earned his MFA in filmmaking from the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. He received his work in social work and international journalism from Tbilisi University in Georgia. For our American viewers, Georgia is not the state, it's the country of Georgia. A lot of my friends get confused with that. Okay, in 2010, he became a finalist for the Berlin Today Award for the Berliner Film Festival with a project called Reflection. Giorgi's film Giorgi, did I pronounce that right? Giorgi, thank you. Awarded for the Best Georgian Documentary Film in 2007. He has directed numerous documentaries, short fiction, and experimental films from 2004 to 2020. His recent work, which I hope we have time to discuss today, is called 12 Lessons, which he received a mention for documentary film at the Tbilisi International Film Festival. His interest is, as he's told me, is exploring experimental processes in documentary films and finished writing a book on the process of reflecting on observations and experimental practices in documentaries. I should note that a couple years ago, we hosted a film series of 3 films by Giorgi, and they're all archived on the VASA site under our film series, which could be viewed for streaming. Okay, so thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Roberto. It's my pleasure.
Okay, mine as well. You call yourself a documentary filmmaker. How did you come from documentary to documentary filmmaker out of sociology and journalism?
It was basically journalism. You know, I've been always interested in documentary films. And even though I studied journalism, at that time, I was making documentary films. I think it's a very interesting balance between the journalism and filmmaking. As you know, both are very different, right? The first, in journalism, for instance, we are looking for objective reality, kind of, you know. And in filmmaking, we are exploring the subjective vision. It's interesting how do they come together. And of course, as a filmmaker, I'm always interested in subjective vision. And at the end, you know, what's objective? Everything that's objective, it's subjectively objective, and vice versa. Everything that's subjective is objectively subjective. So you know, it's interesting to have both skills, and at the end, with the filmmaking, you have lots of possibilities to explore your subjective vision, which is so important, especially today. So for me, it was.
Yeah. So you're saying that there is no objectivity in film, there is no truth. So documentaries are really not truthful representations of reality, except the product of a subjectivity, which is the filmmaker.
Yes, well, let's see. I mean, the imagination is a kind of document, right, as well. As we imagine something, we create a document of whatever we are imagining. So this is our document as we perceive the world, as we see the world. And I think, and I remember one of my school teachers actually mentioned at that time that the most objective kind of rendering of the reality is a poetry, because it's very subjective, right? So I think everything is subjective. It's all about the process of selection, and when it comes to selection, it's already very subjective. So even in for instance, in the news and in broadcast, you have this process of selection of something, and I mean it's very subjective.
Well, your studies in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. By the way, Dick Blau, who was his mentor primarily, is a longtime supporter of VASA, and he recommended Giorgi to me a few years ago, and it was a good recommendation. So I want to tip my hat to Dick. Okay, but basically, I mean, you've come out, you studied experimental process, experimental cinema at Milwaukee. How did that impact or fit with your filmmaking, your documentary film concepts?
Very well, actually. It was a discovery for me, even though I've been always interested in experimental films. To take time, and this was 2 years, to take time and to really concentrate. And UW Milwaukee has a really wonderful school for experimental film. It was just the process, and experimental filmmaking is all about the process. The process is the most important part here, because you don't know how may you end with the film, but the actual process is the most important, and it creates this experience for you, what I call, experimentation, maybe in film. That's the most important part for me.
Well, you're going to show us 2 clips from 2 different films today. Which 2 films are they?
Well, I have 3 films that I wanted to share. So one is Zurabi, the other one Reflection, and the recent one 12 Lessons. So these are very different from one another, and I took different approaches in all of these 3 films. So maybe we can share Zurabi.
არ მიძლევს გული იმასა, რომ გადააბიჯა მწვერვალს რაიად. არ ვიცი, რაიღაცა ის ზებუნებრივი ძალა თუ რაიღაცა თუ სილამაზეა თუ არც არის არც კარგია, რომ თქოთ მწვერვალი დაიფყარა, როგორ უნდა თქვა, მწვერვალი დაიფყარა, კაცო, ის ბუმბერაზი, დიდებული, თა, როგორ დაიფყარა, სიტყვაც არ მოდის ეგრე, დაიფყარა, ან ახვე, ან გადახვე. იყო ადრე, კაცო, ტურებს ვეძახოდით, წელს ტოვებდით იქა და არავდი ახლა აუცილებელი ხო არ არის, რომ გადახვიდე და გადმახვიდე იმ ქედზე, იმ ლამაზ მწვერვალს გადააბიჯა და გადმააბიჯა. ხო, შეიძლება რომ იქ მწვერვალ მიხვიდე ის 2-3 მეტრა და პატივისცა იმ მწვერვალსაც, სიწმინდეს, სიკეთეს. ეხლაც შეამონებს ის საქმე, რომ ზედ არ გადახოლა, არ გადმახოლ. აი ვიცი კი არა, ზუსტად ეგრეა, რომ სილამაზე არ უნდა შაღლაკა, ის წმინდა ადგილი არ უნდა შაღლაკა. მწვერვალს პატივი უნდა სცა, ეს წმინდა ადგილებს პატივი უნდა სცა, არ არის. ჩემ მამა აქ მუშაობდა მეტეოსადურში და დასვენები ბევრი გვეყრებოდა შინ.
You used one source of light. That was the candle.
Yes, it was a candle. It was there, one candle, and it created a very special, intimate moment in the tent. And the Rabbi shared his view and his philosophy for mountains and his way of living. It was a very special moment. You know, he passed away recently, unfortunately, and he was a very famous mountaineer, and he was living near the Mount Kazbegi, in the village Gergeti. So as he was a mountaineer, and you know, mountaineering sometimes considered as a sport, and actually it's not. So for me, at least, it's not a sport, of course. It's interesting. Yes, he was climbing on the top of the mountain. He would always leave few meters and not, you know, step on the summit itself.
Well, excuse me. You said that it was not a sport. Then how is it understood?
For me, it's not a sport. It's not a competition. It's for me, it's as I used to climb, and for me, it was always a very important part of life. Not conquering. I listened to the Rabbi very carefully. It was not about conquering the mountain, but it was a way of life where I would always find, you know, new thoughts. I would always look at the town from the very far from the mountain, and it really gives you a very interesting look at your life there in the city. So yeah, for me, it's not a sport. For many people, it is.
Okay, we are limited on time here with Zoom, so let's go on to your second film clip. Then we have times for discussions after the third.
გაიხედებიო დაიკავე იქით გაიხედებიო მას დაჭერე ხო კაი არის
ის არის ჩასმული რომია გაწი მაშინ ხაწევი აი აკეთ ესა ბექი ძირიდან ფესო ავდა
All right, so this was reflection, an excerpt from reflection. And we filmed it in one of the highest populated places in Europe, actually, in the village of Ushguli. That's in Svaneti, in Georgia. And I wanted to create this very strange object, which is a film screen. So we constructed this huge screen and took it to the village. And was interesting how, once the projector strikes its light on the screen, this light could exist. It can exist now too. Well, as the light travels, who knows? Maybe it's somewhere there. So creating this space for the open air film screening somewhere in mountains. It was really interesting to explore the reflections of people when they were watching these films. We recorded this experience, and on the other hand, this light maybe is traveling somewhere in the universe right now.
So was this I can assume they've seen films before, or is this the first experience?
Of course not. They've seen films, even though it's at that time it was very difficult to get there, and in the winter the road, closes because of the snow. They have TVs, and I think the internet is there now. And anyways, they have seen films, of course. Some of them may have not had this experience of the open air film screening, especially kids, maybe. But film, the projection of the film, and film is always different every time.
What did you show them? What was the film about?
These were three Georgian short films, and they were not about mountain, but three short Georgian films was Pyramid, The Record, and The Jar, by Georgian filmmakers.
And what was their general response to seeing films outdoors?
Of course, we had different reflections, and once you observe how people react, they sometimes are, of course, lost in the screening, and that's the very interesting moment. They forget about everything except of the screen and the story reflected on the screen. So that's, I think, finding those moments that I think we could manage to do was one of the very special and interesting moments.
Okay. Well, let's move on to 12 Lessons, which is your most recent. And in our earlier discussion, you sounded very excited by it. So let's move on to that film.
Sure. Maybe it's worth sharing trailer of 12 Lessons.
Sure. Whatever works best. I should mention to the viewers that the quality of the film is relative to your internet connection, and also are uploading it to Zoom. So
აზიური ფაროსანა საწინააღმდეგო კამპანია გრძელდება ბურიის რეგიონში.
გავრცელებულმა ფაროსანამ ადგილობრივები თხილთან ერთად სიმინდის და ციტრუსის გარეშეც დატოვა. მაგონა აუცილებლად თავად ვიღებდი სრულად განსწავლილი ბაბუი ხომ არ შეგეშინა ბაბუი არ შეგეშინა
The film is about a grandfather and his grandson. A grandfather who teaches him the independent living skills. Well, for me, what I observe in all my films, everything starts from the image. This is an image that consolidates all the shots, all the images, all the sounds, all the scenes and sequences in the film. I have to find this image and I have to discover it through the process. It has to, at the end, it has to find itself. And that's the process of creating films for me. I think in all my films, that's how the process goes. So this is a kind of self-contained image which pre-exists in a way, and at the end, like documentary is all about readiness, being ready to not let the moment go. And the most important here is the process that you go through for me, and that's how actually the 12 Lessons was made. It was the image as I was introduced to the character, to Valery, Valerian Kotrikadze. I immediately, the image immediately formed in my imagination of a grandfather and his grandson, and that was the most important. That's how all started. I went from there.
When you talk about finding that one image that contains everything, is that something that just unfolds within your work, or is it something you construct out of the experience of making the film?
I think both, because when you do something, for many years, even though if you are trying to escape preconceived ideas, I mean, it's like your body reacts to particular situations. It knows how to react, and if you allow, you can get very interesting results with holding a camera in your hands and just allowing your experience to handle the whatever impressions you have at the time.
You have like a guiding script that you follow, that which then you deviate from and let things unfold?
Well, it's very different from film to film. For instance, in Zurabi, I was writing down the events that I knew that would happen, and I have had this kind of scenes that I wanted to film, and then I would go and film scene by scene. In case of reflection, I had very detailed, even very detailed storyboard that even before I went to the location, for instance, to see the place and find the particular, places, locations for filming. I had very detailed storyboard, very primitive, but detailed. And of course, I had a kind of script, very brief descriptions of what I wanted to have in the film. And after that, I mean, it magically happened that all those shots that I imagined within this, and I had the storyboard, all those shots, they become very close to what I had on the storyboard. It was very interesting to see how it happened. In 12 lessons, I went with intuition. I wanted to go with the intuition, and the process of research happened actually during the filming process, because I wanted to react on whatever would unfold in front of us, um, with the intuition and with the experience that existed, um, not with the with the script. Even though I had it involved a long process of writing, I would write after every day of filming long notes, what happened, and there were many interesting, coincidences, maybe with the colors, and so everything is in kind of event, right? What unfolds in front of us. It's all about just preparing yourself and being ready to record all those moments, and that's very important. Sometimes I don't take the camera with me on the first day because it's also a very important part of my process. It doesn't happen always, but in the most cases, that's how it works. I just want to be with the characters. I want to feel uh, the place, because the place also is a very important character at the end, especially in this film. In every film, I think the mountains, they are the character in Zurabi. The mountains are the characters in Reflection, in a way, um, along with people, of course. And the place, the road, especially the road, was an important character in 12 lessons as well. So.
Well, I think what's interesting to me in hearing you talk about the work and seeing the films. I've seen some of them before. Is that documentary film comes out of a really rich tradition out of anthropology and sociology. There's in the States, there was at Temple University a visual anthropology program, and there's also a International Visual Sociology Association, and they still promote the idea of making films. What's interesting for me is at some point within the anthropological movement with films, documenting villages or people or life as it is, which is always seen as being objective, the camera is objective, to more of a post-structuralist or postmodernist idea that there's many truths, and it's the filmmaker and then the viewer that begins to construct reality. Okay, so I'm curious in hearing you think about what your thinking is on that mixture, going back to your ideas on experimental film, right, which also has a very rich tradition coming out of, I would say, pretty much the 60s, a lot of work done in media studies, Paul Scherritz, that group, okay, Howard Frampton, but basically how that began to mold and change the paradigm you worked in, and you call it documentary. I know that's a lot to bundle, but I'm just curious about that.
Well, it's interesting because, what I like in experimental film that it doesn't have these, frames.
Mhm.
It doesn't have these boundaries. Film at the end, film is film. It's an experience and it's a process that you are sharing. And the construction of other stories or, other ways of perception. I mean, for me, it's always important to leave the space for the audience. I mean, I never construct in a way that what I say that should be, or what I show that should be understood in a way that I showed it to you, and that I have some ideas that you should follow. And I'm not interested in. It's always an open space for me because we all, we all construct our stories, and at the end, the stories I constructed could be a different stories when someone else will see the film and construct the story. Right? So it's objective approach. I don't think that there is a kind of objective approach in documentary films. Anyway, it's a very subjective reflection of whatever uh, you are trying to explore. So
Yeah, I mean, the same thing goes for documentary photography, that it's part of the belief was what was seen was before the lens and thus it's real. But people did not really consider the construction of the frame being the attitude or the intentions of the photographer, the decisions they make compared to like a decisive moment, but compared to the decisions, the intelligence behind the camera. And I think that's nice when hearing what you're saying about your own work and the process. It's more talking about the decision making and intelligence behind the camera, in your case, in the making of the documentary film. But it's also, I think, it's problematic where the word documentary has a lot of baggage with it, right? As to what is being truthful and representative of a reality, or the reality in that case.
um, yes, but on the other hand, it's always and the imagination, as we mentioned it before, and imagination, I think, is also part of the reality, and it's very objective. I think sometimes it's more objective than the objective reality itself,
Yeah.
because it's an emotion, and the emotion is always something very real. Because objective reality could be interpreted in many ways, but the emotions are very precise, and they belong to the person, and that's where they start and maybe end. So they have their address in a way. So I think the approach. I'm not saying that the objective approach in a way, as for instance, like observational documentary, is something very different from my process. No, it's sometimes it's very, and all documentaries are observational in a way. So there is no, for me, there is no kind of boundaries or the lines. They always intersect, and they always find each other and talk to each other in a way that the maker of the film finds it useful, or
Well, how much do you impact what happens before the lens, before the camera? What the reason I ask that question is number of years back in the Middletown project, there was a film made called 17, and there was a problem with it where it went to court, and the judge said that the filmmakers, documentary filmmakers, actually went and bought beer for the teenagers that they were filming. Thus, they had an impact on the film. Thus, it was not documentary. Okay, so it's that question of how much influence do you have with your camera, where you stand in a sense, as to what happens before it.
Yes, I mean, it's always a huge influence that the maker of the film has, I think, on the reality that unfolds in front of or, around him or her. Well, of course, the way you approach your character, it's already a kind of influence on whatever may unfold, right? The way you film, the place that the sound recordist chooses for sound recording with sometimes with huge boom mic, it also influences. For instance, I always try to look around and not stand where I can block the characters when they have to leave the room or enter. Sometimes, you find the perfect spot, and then it appears that you just blocked the character from, blocked the exit from the room, or,
What you just mentioned before about influencing the composition of the image, that's the framing of it, basically. Are you aware of the composition while you're working, while you're filming? And do you change the composition at all for, quote, that more aesthetic composition?
Well, yes, sometimes I do. Sometimes I just follow. I mean, it's already there because, from the experience, you know how the composition will work for you and what's the best composition in a particular situation. And you have this experience, so it's already there. And it's sometimes by chance that you move the camera and it appears that the composition is the one you were looking for. But sometimes you know the place, and you know what's the best will come out of the a particular composition. So sometimes it's pre-composed in a way that you are aware, but sometimes it's by chance, and your experience prompts you to change the composition. But the most important, I think, for me, is the character. If you can follow your character, the composition from the experience will change on its own, and you will find the perfect composition through the process. The process will show you and guide what's the best, what the best composition would be in your
Well,
case.
and another, maybe it's the final question because we're getting tight on time. You mentioned character. How, most characters, I'm assuming they're individuals, are not used to somebody following them with a camera. Because they see the camera and they see you behind it. And if there's a boom for sound, they see that, right? Which is basically not shown. How long does it take in your experience, take the character to kind of forget about the camera, to go about what they normally would do, if that's possible?
I never say that we are not here because I think it's very, with the huge boom and the huge camera, sometimes huge camera, sometimes small camera, but it doesn't matter. I never say that we are not here, forget about us.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's a gradual process. It takes sometimes time, but you have to be ready for it. It has to happen naturally. Because once you say that, okay, we are not here, don't look to the camera, I mean, it's already something that really doesn't exist, and you don't want to. I mean, we are there, we are filming, and we are. And by the way, I always avoid saying shooting. So we are not shooting, we are filming.
Okay.
So that's
Okay.
that
Well,
takes time sometimes. But for me, it's a very important to be there.
true, true. But speaking
And my character's aware that
yeah,
I am there with my camera.
yeah, it's kind of hard not to notice somebody with a small or large camera, and if there's audio recording equipment, you know, you're like on a set in a sense, right? A fluid sense. Um, Speaking of time, though, we're pretty much out of time, so I do want to thank you for showing us your films, talking about your process and your work and your ideas. I found it very intriguing.
Well, thank you, Roberto. It was my pleasure talking with you, and yes, I'm glad that you find interesting.
Okay. Well, you take care. Okay.
Take care.
Ciao.
Ciao.